So let's take this exception in here and let's just change it so that this is a checked exception which is being thrown. Now, if it's a checked exception, so divide here, if it throws a checked exception, then it won't compile. So remember, checked exceptions are exceptions that they need to be dealt with. And even IntelliJ, if I put my mouse in here, it says add exception to method signature, or if I click more actions, I can surround with try and catch. Have a look. We're going to try this, and then if it throws an exception, then we catch it and then we do something with it. In this case, it's just printing the stack trace. So the stack trace, again, if I run this, just in case you forgot, so this is the stack trace in here. So it gives us the trace of all the method calls that were invoked up to the point that the exception was thrown. So in our case, if I click in here, you can see line number 10. So this is where it occurred. Line 19, this is where it actually threw the exception. So you can see that this is the stack trace. Now, what I want to show you in here is, so let's say that, let's just get rid of this. Let's just get rid of this for a second. Let's say that we have John. So let's say that we have a method. So let's just make it static and then void and then John. And John in here, John wants to divide. Let's just pass 10 and 0. Now John, so this method John has two options. It can either deal with the exception. So here, if I say try and then put that inside and then catch exception E, and there we go. So this is now John dealing with this exception. So it tried and then it caught the exception. But let's say that John wants to pass this responsibility to someone else. So let's say that we have in here, so let's just have basically the same thing, but I'm going to call it, for example, so Command C there, and let's just call this as Jamila, for example. So Jamila, and Jamila wants to talk to John. Let's say Jamila wants to talk to John. Now check this out. So John doesn't want to deal with this exception, so let's just get rid of this. Now John has two options. As I said, it can deal with the exception, or John can throw this exception. So John can say, right, so if any exception occurs, I'm just going to throw the exception. And you can see that now the responsibility is within Jamila, right? So an exception throws in here, then Jamila now is responsible for handling this exception. Let's say that Jamila in here, so let's just say that we have in here, we have Anna. Let's say that we have Anna. And Anna wants to talk to Jamila. Jamila now has two options. Jamila can actually deal with this exception. So we can surround with try and catch. And you can see that Anna, oops, Anna like that. And you can see that Anna now, she doesn't have to worry if an exception is thrown. Or if Jamila wants to basically pass on the responsibility of dealing with the exception thrown, she can throw. So I'm just going to put my mouse in here, add exception to method signature, throws exception. And you can see that this can go on and on and on and on. So the reason why we need to deal with this exception is because it's a checked exception. Now in here, Anna has two options. She can deal with this exception, or she can, in here, she can throw this exception and let someone else deal with the fact that there was an error. Now within main, let's just basically call Anna and have a look. So now Anna threw the exception. Now within main, we have to deal with the exception. So here we can basically add the surround with try and catch. So we try, otherwise we catch the exception. So if I run this, you can see that this is the stack trace. So cannot divide by 0. So basically it went from here, divide, So this was an exception. So line 31 in here. Then 26 was John. John gave it to Jamila. Jamila gave it to Anna. And Anna gave it to the main method in here. So this is the stack trace. So hopefully now this makes sense. And then at this point in here, so at this point, this is where we print the stack trace. If you are just testing your applications and you don't want to have the try catch in here, so you can get rid of all of this and you can pass this responsibility to the main method. So you can see that now when this was invoked, we just shifted the responsibility to this main method. So if I run this, you can see that it's basically the same thing, but we don't have to have the try and catch block in here. So sometimes you might see people do this. Now this is bad within the main method, and you should really be dealing with the exceptions at the upper levels. So here we need to deal with the exception right here, because at some point someone has to deal with the exception, and you are passing the responsibility for this method, which is invoked by the JVM, so main. And if there is anything wrong with this, it just stops. But maybe you don't want to stop within your main method, right? So here you can see that. So if I run this, have a look, the exit code is 1. Whereas if I pass this to the main method, run this, the exit code is 1, which is a problem, right? But here we are dealing, oops, not this. But here, try, catch, we are dealing with the exception, and then the program can continue because at this point you have full control of your applications. Now, use throws when you don't necessarily want to deal with the exception. If an exception happens, you want the caller to deal with the exception, which is exactly what we've done. So for example, Anna in here, so the caller is the main method, and we'll let the main method decide how to handle this. You should never swallow exceptions, i.e. having a try catch a block. So maybe doing this. So try and then catch, exception, E, and then basically when I mean swallow, I mean this, right? So here you are swallowing the exception, and if anything happens in here, how do you recover from your application? You can't. So it's always best to throw the exception to the upper level and then let the caller deal with the exception the way that it wants. So don't worry if this was a bit complicated, because we're going to learn how to use throws. We're going to throw custom exceptions later, especially once you start learning about Spring Boot, so on and so forth. But this gives you the overall idea of how to work with exceptions. This is all for now. Catch me on the next one.